We'll be in the book of Ruth today. We start a new series we're entitling Real Love. As we go through the book of Ruth, please do not get distracted by the length of the book of Ruth. There's only 4 chapters in it. And sometimes when we read smaller books of the Bible, we assume that the smaller books of the Bible don't have as much to say in them. So there's a lot going on in the book of Ruth that we're going to try to convey the elements of real love. And as we go through this, we're going to dig deeper on the elements and the aspects of true love, of real love, that are revealed. And what's interesting about the book of Ruth, if we're going to boil it down into a nutshell, the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth is essentially the courtship, the marriage of a man named Boaz, a woman named Ruth, and their producing of a child later on. But what happens, we're going to see here, there's some parallels that take place in the book of Ruth between some of the main characters that reflect Christ's real love for us as well. So if you'll find Ruth chapter 1 in your Bibles, I won't ask you to stand today because we'll be reading the entire chapter, but I will ask you to follow along with me as we look at the text. In Ruth chapter 1, again, as you follow along, keep an eye out. Make a mental note of the ideas or the images that we see of real love that are presented in just this first chapter of the book of Ruth. And starting in verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also both of them, and the woman was left with her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place that she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return into the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. And the Lord deal kindly with you, as he had dealt with the dead, and with me. Verse 9, And the Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her household. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice, and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way. For I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, I should also bear sons, would you tarry for them till they were grown? Would you stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth played with her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Where thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. So they too went until they came into Bethlehem. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved about them. And they said, Is this Naomi? And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara. The Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why call you then me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for the privilege of holding in our hands your perfect and completed work. Lord, I pray that you will speak to us in a very real way. I pray that today that you will help us to not just hold your word in our hands. Lord, help us to apply your word to our hearts.
Amen.
Lord, as we read through this passage, as we look at verses that we no doubt have heard before, some verses may be very familiar to the point of being upon memorized. So Lord, I pray you'll help us to see them with fresh eyes today.
Amen.
I pray you'll speak to us in that still small voice. And as you do, Lord, I pray you'll help us to be ready to hear. Lord, as always, I would pray that you would remove any obstacles and hindrances that would get in the way of us hearing from you today. As always, nobody needs to hear from me,
Yes.
but we all need to hear from you.
Amen.
So Lord, I pray you'll speak to us, you'll draw us closer to you today, and you'll walk out of here closer to you than when we walk in. We pray all these things in the perfect, precious, and powerful name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Ruth is a story of redemption. It's a story of providence. But before we can truly understand the deliverance, we have to first understand the devastation. Now, the book of Ruth we read through chapter 1. It begins with a series of tragedies. In just the first few verses, we see a famine, a backslidden family, and 3 funerals. In verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass, when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land." Now, if you remember this time of Judges, if we go back to the previous book, the book of Judges, it tells us that there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And that's where we find this family right now. And there's a danger in God's people doing what's right in our own eyes. Can we just agree there's a problem if I'm living according to my own laws, my own rules, and I'm not looking to God for guidance?
Right.
We all know that's a recipe for disaster, and that's exactly where we find this family here in the first chapter.
Yes.
The book of Ruth begins with this family. It says, living in Bethlehem. Now, ironically, the town of Bethlehem is known as the house of bread. But yet, there's a famine. Now, we don't know much about this family at this point, except they're traveling to the land of Moab. Verse 1 continues and said, "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he, his wife, and his 2 sons." Now, if you'll notice when we read this in our Bibles, this is not underlined or in bold print. It's not highlighted in any way whatsoever. But before we get into the book of the story of Ruth, we need to understand that this is a very big deal. From the very beginning, the nation of Moab was one of immorality. Mm-hmm. The nation of Moab began, if you remember, from Lot's incestuous relations with his daughters. In Numbers chapter 25, it says that the Moabite women led the men of Israel into fornication as they journeyed from Exodus, or as they journeyed in the Exodus from Egypt to Canaan. It says that they had a role in leading King Solomon to falling into sin. In fact, in 1 Kings chapter 11, it says that Solomon loved many strange women, together of the daughters of Pharaoh. And the first ones listed says the women of the Moabites. The Moabite king Balak hired Balaam to curse the Israelites, but he was foiled by the talking donkey, if you remember. A Moabite monarch named Eglon oppressed the Israelites until he was assassinated by an Israelite named Ehud. When the prophet Elisha prophesied Israel's victory over Moab, the king of Moab sacrificed his oldest son as an offering to their gods. The prophets Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all prophesied the destruction of Moab. And when we understand the history of Moab and the relationship with Israel, it changes the tone of this entire journey. This wasn't like Americans heading across the border to Canada. This was an enemy of Israel.
Yes.
A nation the Lord had commanded his children to not be in a relationship with.
Yes.
In the book of Judges, chapter 11, verse 18, it says that as the Israelites traveled through the wilderness, they even refused to go through the territory of Moab. And they went around the outsides through Arnon. In just the first few verses that we've seen, we see a very vivid application. Elimelech made the decision to uproot his family and travel to a nation filled with sin. And on the surface, this almost seems justifiable. There's a famine in his land. He's got to feed his family. So he leaves. But the problem is there's no indication that he asked God what his will is.
That's right. Yes.
He didn't ask God. And here's the biggest problem. He didn't trust God. in our own lives, if we're going through difficulties right now, if we got to be honest with us, if we're not asking God for his wisdom, we're not trusting God for his wisdom. If we're not asking God for deliverance, we're not trusting God to deliver. If we're trying to make our own way, we're not trusting God to make the way. We're depending on ourselves. He didn't ask God because he didn't trust him. And when faced with a decision to make on whether to trust God, Elimelech instead uprooted his family from the place where God's people dwelt. To live in a wicked country where there would be no place to worship God and no fellowship with other believers. And the results we see are devastating. Elimelech's decision didn't only affect himself. We see here that it had a grave impact on his entire family. And make no mistake about it. When you leave God's will for your life, you will not be the only one who's affected by it.
That's right, yes.
It will affect your life. It will affect your kids. It will affect your family.
Yes.
Now, ironically, remember here, we see Elimelech left to escape death. In just the first 3 verses, we see that's exactly what he found when he stepped outside of God's will.
Yep, you're right.
Verse 3 tells us that Elimelech died, and then verse 5, both of his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, both died as well. If we engage in activities or relationships that are outside of God's will for our lives, the result is devastation.
Yes.
And the devastation is rarely confined to the single individual who made the decision. We've all seen people who've stepped outside of God's will for their lives, pursuing relationships or lifestyles that are in clear contrast to what God has revealed as his will for us. And those decisions might seem to be going okay for a while. Remember, Hebrews 11:25 tells us that there is pleasure in sin for a season.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Nehemiah 32:23 tells us, be sure your sin will find you out.
Yes.
We have no idea. We see here they sojourned for 10 years. But we have no idea how long this family had already been living in a backsliding condition before they got to Moab.
Yep.
At the end of verse 2 it says, they came to the country of Moab, says they continued there. That indicates that their intention wasn't just to pass through. That word continued indicates that they remained there or that they had settled down there. But sure enough, their sin found them out. When we step outside of God's will for our lives, there are consequences. It's just a matter of time. As God's people, we have the unique opportunity to know his will and to live under the umbrella of his protection. Those times in our lives when the storm hits, when the famines hit, when the droughts come, when the difficulties come, it's in those seasons where we either choose to seek him and trust him, or we rely on our own understanding and make our own decisions. Ultimately, what we see here from the first 3 verses is that God's plan, God's way is always better than our own. Just the first few verses, we see devastation, a famine, a family far away from God, 3 funerals. We'd all agree this is not a happy beginning. But the good news is God is good, and God restores. Now, this book starts with a family devastated, largely by the decisions they made that took them away from God. But thankfully, that's not how the story ends. What starts with devastation will end with deliverance. But before we get to the good part, we see yet more difficulties. First, we see devastation. Next, we see desperation. In verses 3 and 5, we saw that Elimelech had died, and then that both sons, Mahlon and Chilion, died as well, leaving Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws as widows. And verse 9 says, they lifted up their voice and wept. The term here that says they lifted up their voice, this doesn't simply mean that they wept out loud. It indicates such grief, such sorrow, such pain, that their only human response that they could muster up was to cry out in pain. There was nothing they could do other than to break down and cry. Now, obviously, losing a family member is reason enough for grief. But try to put yourself in the shoes of these women. Naomi had lost her husband. And in their culture, a widow would then be supported by the remaining sons. But since her sons had also died, Naomi was hopeless. Orpah and Ruth, hopeless. The prospects for their livelihood had changed drastically.
Yes.
With no one to support them, no one to care for them, they would be left to survive off what little they could receive from others. And we see Naomi's concern for her daughter-in-laws in verse 9, where she tells them to return to their homelands and find new husbands. It's hard to describe just how desperate of a situation these women were now in. When their husbands died, essentially, their hope died. With no sons to support them, they had nowhere else to turn to. Their ability to sustain themselves in the present, as well as any security for the future, was gone. See, when the nation of Israel went and possessed Canaan, the land was divided up into 12 tribes. And within those allotments, the land was divided up by families. No man was allowed to sell his land outside of his given tribe. But because their husbands were dead, these women now had no way of reclaiming family land. In their society, it left these women completely vulnerable and completely helpless. In case of financial difficulty, a man would often sell off or mortgage his land, in which case he would lose all right to the land until it had been redeemed by either paying off the mortgage or until the year of the Jubilee, when all debts were canceled away. But thankfully, where man fails, God prevails. Even though these women were helpless, God had already made provision for them long before this famine or the devastation ever hit. We're going to look at the love and provision of God throughout the next few weeks. But as we focus on the elements of real love, we see some really beautiful examples of it taking place in the next few verses. We see fingerprints of God's love all over this story of Ruth and Naomi. And one indication of real love we see is found in verse 14. In the midst of devastation, while living in a state of complete desperation, we see an example of real love, which is devotion. Verse 14, it says that after Naomi advised her daughter-in-laws to return to their homelands, to try to find security, to preserve themselves, it says Orpah kissed her, but it says, but Ruth clave with her. That word clave means to cling to or to hold tightly to. It gives the idea of holding someone or being so closely joined together that nothing can come between them. In Genesis chapter 2, when talking about marriage, it says that a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. In terms of one flesh, it needs to be so connected, so joined together, be so devoted to each other that nothing can separate. In spite of the difficulties, in spite of the devastation, in spite of the desperation that had taken place, Ruth demonstrates devotion to Naomi. And devotion is an illustration of real love. Real love is not a temporary or a fleeting thought. It's not based on emotions or circumstance. Real love we see here in verse 14 is choosing to continue to display love regardless of the situation. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it says that love bears all things and endures all things. Let's go a little bit further. Bearing and enduring are not terms of happiness or enjoyment. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul tells us to bear one another's burdens. It's not, if I can put it this way, real love isn't the feelings of happiness and excitement of when you're dating or newly married. It's remaining devoted when things take a turn for the worse. When there are financial challenges. When there are health problems. Real love isn't just the kiss at the wedding, at the altar in front of all your friends and family. Real love is what takes place when no one else is around. When you have a loved one who can no longer care for themselves. And you sacrifice. You bear those burdens that they can no longer bear themselves. We see that here in Ruth. When everything inside of you is telling you just go. To go take care of yourself. Real love endures. Ruth says here, look, I know my husband has died. Your husband has died. We have no land. We have no money. We have no future. From the outside perspective, I have no hope. I have no reason to remain. There's nothing keeping me here, but I'm not going anywhere. That's the devotion we see from Ruth. And here's the kicker, to her mother-in-law. Someone who now she has no legal bounds to support. She's not required to stay. She is free to go and do as she wishes, but she chooses to be devoted to someone, even though she doesn't have to be.
Yes.
Choosing to endure. God's fingerprints of love are all over this story.
Yes. Amen.
Do you know who else endured as a sign of his love? Jesus.
Yes.
Hebrews chapter 12 says that he endured the cross, despised the shame. But why? Why did he endure the cross? For the joy set before him.
Yes. That's right.
Ephesians
Yes.
chapter 2 says, for the great love wherewith he hath loved us. God loved us so much that he was willing to endure pain. He was willing to persevere through difficulties because his devotion was a sign of his real love for us. And we see here also in verse 14 that real love goes beyond words. I'm sure in verse 14 when they were all crying together, Orpah probably told Naomi that she loved her. I'm sure she said all the things that we would expect her to say in this circumstance. You know, I love you. I'm going to miss you. If you need anything, please let me know. But notice, she may have said the right things, but there's no indication that she actually ever did any of it.
Yeah.
It's nice to have good intentions. But intentions without devotion is empty. 1 John 3:18 says, let us not love in word nor in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Orpah may have talked about love, but we see here that Ruth demonstrated real love.
Yes. Amen.
Her faithfulness, her devotion to cling to Naomi is a picture of God's love and devotion to us. And God tells us that when we draw nigh to him, he draws nigh to us.
Amen.
And how close will he stay? Just as Ruth claimed to Naomi, Romans chapter 8 tells us that nothing can separate you from the love of Christ.
Amen.
Regardless of what types of devastation you've experienced in the past. No matter what type of desperation you may have ever gone through. God has promised to not only come alongside you, but to enjoin you so completely. John says that God will not just only take you under his arm, but he'll lift you up and hold you in his hand, and no man can ever pluck you out of his Father's hand.
Right.
Real love is demonstrated by a devotion that draws together and refuses to let go. One element of real love that we see is devotion. And next we see is decisiveness. Verse 16 we read, when Ruth says to Naomi, it says, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Now this is interesting once again, because this is the discourse between a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law. And we live in a society in which there's a lot of jokes made about sometimes the friction that can exist between those types of relationships. I heard a story one time of a man who he never got along well with his mother-in-law. The entire time they were married, they kind of tolerated each other. There was never really no nice words shared, no gifts at Christmas time. She didn't like him, and he didn't really like her. The time came and she got older and passed away. And at the funeral, when they were wrapping things up, the man started to cry. And his wife was shocked by it. She didn't want to make a deal of it in front of anybody there. So on the way home, she asked him, she said, "Now you really did love Mom, didn't you?" And he didn't say anything. She said, "I saw you crying. You don't have to hide anymore. You really did love Mom." He said, "Love her? I thought I saw her move." Anyway, so we kind of see sometimes there tends to be some friction sometimes between some relationships that are unheard. But notice here the level of Ruth's conviction and commitment in these verses. These are not the words offered by a person there during a difficult time, simply to help the other person cope with the difficulty that they're going through.
Amen.
Ruth is not just speaking here to encourage Naomi. The terms that she uses, the language that she uses, she's making a vow to her. She's making a covenant
Yes.
that indicates her love and devotion. She says, where you go, I will go.
Mm-hmm.
Where you lodge, I will lodge. Where you die, I will die. In other words, no matter what happens, no matter what you go through, I will be there with you. Every day from here on out for the rest of your life. No matter what you go through, even when you die, I'm still going to be there right with you,
Amen.
right by your side.
Amen.
Once again, who does that remind us of? Jesus. Once again, Jesus' love for us is revealed so beautifully in this story between Ruth and Naomi. Ruth says, don't ask me to leave, for whither thou goest, I will go. Jesus said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Ruth said, where you die, I will die. Jesus said, I'm with you always, even to the end of the earth. Ruth said, I know you're hurting. I know you're struggling. But let me ease your burdens. Peter said, cast all your cares on Jesus, for he cares for you. We see elements of real love, devotion, decisiveness. Finally, today we're going to look at Ruth's determination. Verse 18 says, when she saw, once again it says Naomi, when Naomi saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. After Ruth's pledge, we just read, to never leave Naomi, it was clear that her mind was made up. There's no use trying to talk her out of this. No use trying to convince her to change her mind. Even though Naomi knew the trials and the grief that Ruth would have to go through, she saw that Ruth was determined to stay with her. By staying with Naomi, Ruth was essentially laying down her life. She was submitting herself to a life of difficulty. Ruth could have left and gone home. She could have possibly remarried, found another husband, and lived a life of relative ease compared to what the future looked like at this point in her life by staying with Naomi. Ruth could have pursued what was easiest or most convenient for her, but she didn't. Once again, we see illustrations of God's love for us in this story. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 tells us that love or charity seeketh not her own. In other words, real love is not demonstrated by doing what's best for yourself. Real love is demonstrated by putting the other person first. And here's the kicker. Putting the other person first, no matter how it affects us.
Amen.
If we're reminded of the sacrifice that God made for, that Jesus made for us,
Yes.
when he put us first, what he went through,
Yes.
what he sacrificed. I was here. Ruth sacrificed a life of relative ease by maybe going back to her homeland and remarrying, regaining some stability, financially speaking. Jesus left his throne in heaven to come down to a simple world.
Yep.
Why? Because he loved us.
Yep. That's right. Amen.
Ruth was going to bypass some of the security that she would have of being taken care of for. Jesus gave himself, gave his body to be beaten,
Yes.
bruised, broken. Why? Because he loved us.
Yes.
Real love is demonstrated by putting other people first, regardless of how it affects us. No matter what plans we might have to change. Real love includes, as we see here with Ruth, laying down her own will. And again, that reminds us of Jesus. John chapter 6, verse 38, Jesus said, I come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but to do the will of him that sent me. Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, Jesus said he didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Ruth could have left Naomi, but she didn't. Jesus could have avoided persecution.
Yep. That's right.
He could have avoided rejection.
Yep.
He could have avoided being put to death,
Yes.
but he did.
That's right.
Why?
Amen.
Because he loved us.
Amen.
We used to sing an old hymn and it said, he could have called 10,000 angels
Yes.
to destroy the world and set him free.
Mm-hmm.
He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me.
Amen.
Jesus loved us with a love determined. The term we see here in our text, with a love steadfast on paying the cost for our sins. He could have turned his back and walked away, but he didn't. Our text here in verse 18 says that Ruth was steadfastly waiting. And Jesus also was firm, unflinching, unfailing in his willingness to give his life for ours. As we see here from our text, there are times when things happen in our lives that have the possibility of destroying us.
Yes.
Different trials and challenges that have the potential of devastating our life, devastating our health, our relationships, our spiritual walk. Things that bring us to our knees. Situations that crush us, where we feel overwhelmed. But yet, in the midst of our desperation, if we're looking for them, we still see signs of God's love all around us. We see his devotion, his faithfulness. We're reminded of the depths of his love for us. In this story we just read, we've seen elements of real love that God demonstrates towards us in the ways that he interacted with Naomi. Things are very seldom easy in our lives. We talked about that this morning in our adult Sunday school class when it comes to discipleship. You know, John says that in this world ye shall have tribulations.
Yep. That's right.
There's no questions about it. Things are seldom easy. But if we look closely enough, we see that despite all of the desperation, despite all the devastation, despite all the destruction, God's love is always present in our lives. The issue is, do we get sidetracked and step outside of God's will when those trials come? Or are we going to trust God, rely on his goodness, rely on his faithfulness to sustain us and provide for us the way that he's promised in our life? We can have our head bowed and every eye closed.